Hi, so this is going to be chapter 1, and I'm going to break this down into sections. And so hopefully, as you go through the chapter, my presentation as well as your reading will help you understand this. So the background that you see here is I'm actually recording at my home, and so you'll just have to excuse the colors and all the other things that are going on. I might have some critters that might show up, but hopefully not. Okay, so chapter 1 is dealing with why do we need statistics. So some of this is actually going to be a little bit of a review because you probably had some of this, but I think that a review is not always bad when it comes to stats. So I'm going to cover in this presentation pages 1 through 11. So I realize that this is a lot of reading in this book. He gives some very interesting examples. Just kind of go with the flow with his examples because this guy is very, very good at presenting his material. And so we might use other examples, but we'll have to work through some of the examples that he's using. But for now, pages 1 through 11. Okay, so types of data analysis that you are going to discuss. So primarily in this class, I'm going to talk a little bit about quantitative methods. All right, quantitative is you are testing theories and you're using numbers. All right, so you're using numeric. And a lot of people say, I don't want to do quantitative. Quantitative scares me. SPSS, statistical analysis, it scares me. But I can tell you that it is intimidating when you have an overwhelming amount of information when it comes to stats. But honestly, once you get your data and once you run your numbers, it's a little bit easier process than doing the next one, which is qualitative. So you've probably talked a little bit about qualitative in a qualitative class. I'm assuming you guys have had the qualitative class where you have to find themes and you have to make sure those themes match up based on your interviews. That's a good technique. Now, some of you are going to come to with research questions and you say, well, I want to interview people, but I also want to collect some numbers, and that's great. Part of my dissertation, actually I did a research project prior to my dissertation where I measured spinal cord injured people, and I had some very specific physiological measures that I was doing, but then I also had interview questions about how this particular program affected them and how they felt about it. So that was a mixed method. So looking at some quantitative and qualitative. Some people say, well, you got to only do quantitative, and others people say, no, qualitative. And then there's a big argument between those two. But the reality is, if you are using the method to answer your research question, that's going to be the important part of data analysis. So how do I know if I use quantitative or qualitative research? So one of the questions is, how are you collecting your data? All right, so how are you measuring your data? Are you doing a survey of some kind? Are you collecting numeric data? Are you using a survey that is giving you a total score? I've worked with several doctoral students who say, you know, I'm going to measure emotional intelligence, or I'm going to measure mindfulness. Okay, well, how are you going to measure that? And how do you interpret the measurements? So you might go out there and say, I've got the survey. We need to know, and you need to know, how do you actually evaluate the results of that survey? Because sometimes it's numeric, and you can evaluate those scores and you can run that data using quantitative. So there are some quantitative things that you can even do with qualitative. All right, so kind of keep that in your mind if you're thinking, I'm not doing quantitative. There is some quantitative stuff that you have to do. So good question to ask is, how are you measuring your data? And I ask students this over and over again when they come to me and say, here's my research question. What do I need to do? I'm going to ask you, how are you measuring it, and how do they calculate those scores, or how do they determine the outcome of perhaps a survey? Okay, so here's the research process. You've probably seen this. Let me move my screen here a little bit so that you can see. There you go. All right, so your data, you've got an initial observation, you've got a theory that drives that initial observation, you've got to generate a hypothesis, and you're identifying variables within those hypotheses. You're going to generate predictions. Based on those predictions, you're going to then go out and collect data to test those predictions, which means you're going to measure variables. And I'm going to go through these steps a little bit more detail, and then you're going to analyze your data, which is the place where most of us are scared of stats, but an analysis of data is not that scary. Okay, so your initial observation, these are just something that you observe. Most of you are working in higher ed. You've maybe observed some things. You've maybe, if you're looking at retention rate, and then you're thinking, okay, what is it that allows our students to stay here? What is it that causes our students to leave? Why are we losing students? Why are they not staying in West Texas? How do we get students to West Texas? All right, so you're observing these things. You know it. You're in the work environment, and this may be part of your research question. Your research question may be associated with the job that you're doing. So you observe that, you know something's going on, and then you theorize what it is, all right? So maybe you're, based on your data and the things that you've been exposed to, you're like, you know what, I think that it has to do with the fact that there's not a lot of engagement with the students. All right, maybe that, so you have to test that, you collect data. Now, obviously, in this process for your doctoral work, we don't do a pre-project, all right? So when I did my doctorate, we did like a pre-project, kind of like a pilot study. Some of you may have some pilot data we can look at to help generate some of your hypothesis statements. But you have to identify what are the variables, all right? So here we've got identify the variable. What is it you're going to measure? That's what I mean by the variable. So what is it you're going to measure? I'm going to measure retention. Okay, so what are the factors you think are affecting retention? Is it gender? Is it income? Is it distance from home? Is it cultural connectedness? You know, so you start looking at those variables, and some of you may know the answers to this, and they're like, I really believe that culturally, West Texas meets the needs of these particular types of students. All right, so you go out and you identify your variables. So one of the recommendations that I would suggest to you all is, if you have a research question, is start thinking, what are the variables that I'm going to measure that I think are related to that? And then you can like just brainstorm, write them all down. And then you can winnow them out and you can say, okay, I'm not going to look at those 5 because that's going to enlarge my project and it's too difficult to do, or whatever the situation is. But just start thinking about what are the variables that you're going to be measuring. All right, so just some terminology. The book goes into this terminology, or of course a theory is a hypothesized general principles or set of principles that explain known findings. So I can theorize that you know, I'll use my field, for example, people who have spinal cord injury, they theorize that there is what they call a central pattern generator that exists within the spinal column. So everything usually comes from our brain, right? When we start moving, but somebody breaks their neck or breaks their back, they can still walk on a treadmill even though there's no connectivity between the brain and the spinal cord. So one of the theories is that within the spinal cord, you have a smart spinal cord, and it's able to generate a walking pattern. All right, so think about what is the theory that's going to support your reason to collect this data. Hypothesis is a prediction, it's an educated guess. All right, so it's an educated guess because you're not guessing based on your opinion. Okay, so it's really, really easy for us to say, I think, because you have to actually have literature to support. So when you think about writing your dissertation, this is your literature review. All right, this is the reason and the rationale on why you are generating this research question, because you are making an educated guess based on the literature, based on what the research is saying. And then falsification is disproving your hypothesis, which we'll talk about that a little later on. So here you collect your data. So your hypothesis statement as to what you think will happen, specifically if you're doing an experiment, or what you believe the outcome will be. So some key terms here. These are going to be really important key terms that you go through, because I'm going to ask you guys, and your chair is going to ask you some of these. The independent variable versus the dependent variable. So the independent variable is what causes the dependent variable to change. Maybe another way to think about this, the dependent depends on the independent. So I'll use an exercise example because it's my field, but my body fat depends on, so that's the dependent variable, that's what I'm measuring. My body fat depends on how much I exercise. How much I exercise is my independent variable. Okay, so my dependent variable, what is being measured? That's another way to think about if you're struggling with, okay, what's the dependent variable? What are you measuring? Because what you're measuring is going to be your dependent variable. Independent variable is what are you using to manipulate that dependent variable? What is it that's causing that change? Okay, this last little section talks about levels of measurement. Okay, so this you're gonna read these things and be like, why do I even care? Why do I care about the level of measurement? The level of measurement is going to matter because ultimately, when you run statistical analyses, you have to know the type of measurement. All right, so the type of measurement determines the type of analysis that you run. So you have binary variables, only two categories, binary is two. That one's pretty straightforward, dead or alive, male or female. You have nominal variables, and there's more than two categories. So here's an example, omnivore, vegetarian, vegan, or fruitarian. You know, honestly, when I run data, I always tell my students nominal gender, for instance, males and females, it's a nominal variable. Ordinal is the same as the nominal variable, but the categories have a logical order. I always like to think of an ordinal as ranked data. All right, so he uses the example here where the people get a fail, a pass, a merit, or distinction on their exam. So there's a logical order here. You either fail it, you pass it, you get a merit, or you get distinction. So that's kind of like ranked data. All right, and then the other two types of variables are what's known as continuous. All right, so you've got categorical variables, or you've got continuous variables. The most frustrating thing I think with stats is that you're going to read this and be like, oh, okay, I'm going to go to Google because Google's got all of the answers, correct? But the problem is different researchers and different authors of stats use different terminology. So somebody will talk about a continuous variable, and then somebody will talk about an interval variable, and you got to know that that is the same thing. So you have interval and ratio variables. Interval variables have equal intervals. So think of a ruler, all right? The difference between interval and ratio, because they are almost exactly the same. And what I usually tell students is interval has no absolute zero, all right? So in other words, the value can go below zero and that still exists. Temperature, for example, if I tell you that the temperature outside is zero, which in the middle of summer here, it is definitely not zero. But if the temperature was zero, you still feel cold, right? So the temperature doesn't go away just because there's zero. A ratio variable, on the other hand, does have an absolute zero. So if, for instance, I'm measuring somebody's heart rate and they don't have a heart rate, they don't have a heart rate. They don't even exist anymore, all right? But if they're still breathing and they're talking to me, then I know I am making a measurement error. So the way to distinguish between interval and ratio variables is ratio, there's equal intervals between, think of a ruler, 1, 2, 3, 4. The same distance exists between 1 as exists between 2 and 3, as exists between 3 and 4, and 5 and 6, and so forth. All right, but the difference being between interval and ratio is one goes below 0 and the other one cannot. Okay, so again, I'm coming back to why is this important? So if you tell me you are going to be measuring emotional intelligence, I'm going to ask you what type of variable, what type of measurement is this? Are you going to get a numeric value? So are you going to total all of your emotional intelligence scores and you're going to get a total of 110 out of 150? Okay, well then I know it's ratio data. All right, so be thinking about what are the measures that you're going to use and how is that measurement going to be classified based on this type, based on these levels. So here's some examples of levels of measurement. So again, I'm going to use emotional intelligence, ratio, it's got a total score that's obtained, the values mean something, and ratio cannot. Emotional intelligence cannot be a negative number. Leadership type, nominal, you can fit into one category. All right, one type of category. And then retention rate is ratio. It's a numeric value, cannot go below 0. I think my screen, there we go, that moves that out of the way. So I've got ratio, it's a numeric value, cannot go